In these next segments, we're going to take a look at bone as a connective tissue. So we're going to explore the cells that make up bony tissues, the material that makes up the extracellular matrix of bone tissue. So recall that all connective tissues have material that exists outside of the cells called extracellular matrix. And in this case, we're going to take a look at what the extracellular matrix of bone is made of and what makes it tough and hard so that that bone can be supportive and protective and fulfill those functions like it does. Okay, so bone is a connective tissue. The primary cell type of bone tissue is a cell type called the osteocyte. Bone does have a number of other cells in it that perform different functions, but the primary cell is going to be the osteocyte, and I'll make sure to point out where these particular cells are located in bone tissue and what their specific function is as we get to that point. The extracellular matrix of most connective tissues is soft. That is, it's mostly made of proteins or glycoproteins and water. Bone tissue is different in that the extracellular matrix is reinforced by minerals. In this case, the primary mineral that reinforces the extracellular matrix and makes it tough and hard, like in bone tissue, is primarily calcium. Specifically, the primary mineral is a mineral called calcium phosphate. So in looking at the anatomy of bone tissue, that is, looking at the internal structure of what's going on inside of bone tissue, bones are really quite anatomically complex on the inside. That is, bones, if you look deep inside of them, they're not solid structures. What we end up having, or what we end up seeing inside of bones here, is if you section or slice a bone and you take a look at the internal structures, what you're going to see is that the walls or the superficial surface of that bone is going to be a dense, very thick bone material, and then on the inside you either have some hollow spaces that form cavities, or what you're going to see in some parts of it is this almost kind of spongy-like honeycomb kind of configuration of bony tissue. So what we're going to take a look at first, we're going to take a look at this dense, thick, superficial layer of bony tissue that's called compact bone. And so this is what it looks like under the microscope. Essentially what it is that it is these units of concentric ring-like structures with essentially a cavity in the middle that contains blood vessels. So this cavity is going to be bringing nutrients and materials to the cells that are occupying the bone tissue that are surrounding it in these ring-like structures. Okay. So these concentric ring-like structures that I mentioned are referred to as osteons, and so these are really kind of concentric rings that are kind of nested in one another very tightly. And so everything within, this would be one osteon here, so everything within it, all of the rings that make up that osteon are located within it, and finally the cavity that's within the middle that contains the blood vessels. So if we look more closely at the cavity that's in the middle of blood vessels, this cavity is very aptly called the central canal, simply because it's located within the center of the osteon. The book also refers to it as the Haversian canal. So both of these, either of these terms is technically correct. I tend to use the term central canal a little bit more. But what the central canal houses is that you have these, it has blood vessels within it, so it's bringing nutrients to all of the cells of bone tissue that reside in the concentric rings that surround it. So what you have are these very dense layers or these dense rings of bony tissue kind of packed close to one another. These little pits that you see here are where the bone cells, the osteocytes, are going to be residing. And I'll talk more about the name of these little pits later. They're called lacunae. But as I mentioned, blood vessels are found within here. So essentially the cells, the osteocytes of the bone tissue are surrounding and staying within very close proximity to the blood vessels that are bringing oxygen and nutrients to them. There's also a number of nerves in there, so that way they can deliver sensations or sensations of different stimuli to or from the bones to the central nervous system, so that we know what's going. Our central nervous system knows what's going on with different stimuli in those bones. So I wanted to kind of switch perspectives here and take a look at the central canals. So we saw them in kind of the microscopic view, where it just kind of looks like a single hole in the middle of the osteon. But what these really are, these are long vertical shafts or long vertical canals that occupy the center of each osteon. And it initially looks like just kind of superficially that they're not physically connected to one another, but they have these horizontal canals that are called perforating canals that essentially interconnect them and allow blood vessels to kind of wind their way through the bone tissue there. So again, we've got the central canals forming these vertical, essentially these vertical passageways through our compact bone in the very superficial layers of our bone of interest there. And then you have these perforating canals that are horizontally connecting them so that blood vessels and nerves can easily wind their way and make their way to all parts of that bony tissue there. I like this view too because it shows a little bit better view of, or at least it takes a little bit better perspective of what those concentric rings in the osteon actually look like. I described them earlier as concentric rings, but really what these are ring-shaped pillars of bone that are kind of nested within one another, and they've kind of expanded them here in sort of a telescopic view, so you can so they've kind of pulled one out from the other, so you can get an idea that these are long, almost pipe-like structures that are kind of nested within one another. So we'll talk about their function in the next few minutes here. So the concentric rings in the osteon, the pillars of the ring-like pillars of bone that we had described. I haven't given you the formal name of these structures. The formal name of these structures, these are called lamellae. And again, you can kind of see here, this is one osteon right here, the central canal occupying the center of that osteon. And then you can kind of you can kind of see a little bit to the borders between each of the lamellae here. The lamellae, as I mentioned, these are essentially ring-like pillars of bone, and they really do behave like pillars because they are weight-bearing pillars. So they're essentially helping to carry the body's weight because they are essentially oriented in the same direction as the force of body weight is applied to our bones. So they're oriented in exactly the same direction as body weight. So they're helping to support the body's weight on these ring-shaped pillars, and so they're very sort of analogous to pillars on a building that are helping to support the overall structure of that building. The lamellae are not just pillars of bone; they also have connective tissue fibers that are essentially wound within them or spiraling within them. Unsurprisingly, this particular fiber type is collagen. So collagen, as I mentioned a few times, is one of the most abundant of the proteins in the human body. So it's not too surprising that it's found here. But these lamellae actually contain collagen fibers, and what's special about these collagen fibers is that they kind of wind their way around the lamellae in either clockwise or counterclockwise directions, and they switch direction with each successive lamellae. That is, in one lamella they may be spiraling clockwise. In the next one, they'll be spiraling counterclockwise, and they'll continue to switch direction in successive lamellae there. So why do they alternate directions? What purpose do they have to switch directions in every other lamella within that osteon? The reason is that, if you recall, collagen fibers make a really good rope in that they're going to resist tensile or pulling forces very, very well. And it turns out that the reason why they're spiraled in different directions or alternating directions in different lamellae is because it helps the lamellae resist twisting forces. And so really you can twist a bone in a clockwise or in a counterclockwise direction, and so alternating fiber direction allows them to resist twisting forces no matter what direction they come from. Okay, so we've taken a look at compact bone. We've seen the structure of the osteon, the ring-like pillars of bone, the lamellae, and the central canal that occupies the center of it and brings nutrients to it. Now we'll focus our attention on the honeycomb-like structure of bone that's usually found in the ends of things like long bones. So a long bone is typically a bone of the appendicular skeleton, usually in the arms or the legs, and it is, or I should say, upper limbs and lower limbs. And typically this honeycomb-like bone is found in the very ends of those bones, but it is also found in other locations like the skull and the vertebrae that we'll see later on. But why is it configured like this? Why aren't bones just solid structures? Bones, if they were solid structures, they would be too heavy they would be more heavy, or they'd be heavier than they need to be to support body weight. So hollowing out bones, or at least making them, giving them this honeycomb-like configuration, allows material to be put into bone, like materials to be stored in bones. We talked about things like adipose tissue and red bone marrow that are found internally within bones. So it allows our skeleton to store stuff within it, but it also helps keep bones lightweight but supportive. So essentially the skeleton is not unnecessarily heavy with this honeycomb-like configuration of bone. So the bone still has enough internal support to help support body weight, but it's not overly built. That is, it's not heavier, it's not denser and thicker than it needs to be. So not surprisingly, this internal honeycomb-like configuration of bone is what's referred to as spongy bone, simply because there's lots of open spaces between pieces of bony material that are laid down in this. In living tissue, these are not empty. This is simply what you would see in a dried specimen of bone, but it allows materials to be kind of packed in between the spaces of the spongy bone. It only composes about 25% of the skeleton, so 75% of the skeleton is compact bone, that very thick, dense bone that we see on the superficial surface of our bones. And spongy bone makes up only about a quarter of the bone mass, the bone density in our skeleton. Okay, so we've looked at the structure of bone tissue in compact bone and in spongy bone. Now I wanted to turn our attention to the extracellular matrix of bone tissue. So recall that being a connective tissue, right, all connective tissues, including bone, have a substance that is called extracellular matrix. And so this is a material that exists outside of the cells of that tissue, and it's made out of two things. It's made of a material that's collectively referred to as ground substance, and then it's also made of protein fibers. And of course, these cells also occupy connective tissues as well. But here what I wanted to focus on was what makes up the ground substance in bone. That is, how is it different than other connective tissues? So the ground substance of bone actually has two components to it. One of those components is what we call an inorganic component. And what I mean by this term inorganic, the term inorganic is implying that this is a non-protein material, like a mineral. So, and these are things like the calcium minerals that are making bones hard and supportive, right? So non-protein materials such as minerals. There are two primary calcium-based minerals that we find in the skeleton. We find calcium carbonate is one of those, and calcium phosphate is the other one. And we saw the inorganic components. The inorganic components actually make up a good majority of the skeleton, so about 66% or two-thirds of bone tissue by weight is inorganic components. And the remaining one-third is what we call the organic components. So these are protein materials and collagen fibers and things like that. So protein-containing materials like glycoproteins. So recall that most connective tissues have a number of glycoproteins or sugar-coated proteins that are within them that give the extracellular matrix kind of a gel-like consistency. And of course that makes up the remaining 33% or one-third of the bone tissue weight that we haven't accounted for yet. Because we just looked at ground substance, the primary fiber type within the ground substance in bones is again collagen fibers. So as I've mentioned a few times now, collagen is one of the most abundant proteins in the human body. So not only is it found in the lamellae of compact bone, but it's also found in the extracellular matrix of all bone tissue. So bone, I've kind of described the fact that we have essentially two different materials that compose bone. We have an inorganic material that's hard and tough, and we have an organic material that's flexible and resists tension. So because bone is essentially made of two materials with very different properties, bone is what we call a composite material. So a composite material is simply a material that's made of two or more different materials or substances that each have different properties and different functions. So what this means is when we combine these two materials, the functions and the properties of the whole material are going to be greater than the sum of the parts of that material. So essentially what we're going to get is this material that can withstand many, many different types of stresses and stimuli. So we're going to take a look at exactly what we mean by composite material with bone. So the organic materials of bone, like the collagen fibers and the glycoproteins, are really good at tolerating pulling forces or tensile forces. So as I mentioned before, collagen is essentially a good biological rope, so it's going to be able to withstand tensile forces without stretching out. So in order to illustrate how bone material would behave, let's consider a scenario in which we have a bone that does not have the organic materials within it. So in the lab, what you're going to see, you'll see a few examples of bones that have been kiln dried, and when we do that, we're removing the organic materials. The collagen fibers and the glycoproteins are essentially drying up, and so we're essentially removing them from bone. When we have bone that doesn't have organic material in it, bone is excessively brittle and it breaks quite easily. And there's actually a disease that results from the fact that collagen fibers are not correctly made or laid down in the correct proportions within bone tissue, and this particular disease is referred to as osteogenesis imperfecta. And so this is where a person with this particular disease, their bones would be quite brittle and break very, very easily. Okay, so we've looked at the organic materials and what they do. What do the inorganic materials do? The inorganic materials, they tolerate a completely different type of force. So the inorganic materials of bone, so that is the calcium minerals, the calcium carbonate and the calcium phosphate that we discussed, tolerate compressive forces. So these are really good at resisting crushing types of forces. So we can put body weight on them, and they're going to be able to hold. They're going to be able to hold up that body weight very, very well without failing. So let's consider a scenario in which we remove the inorganic materials of bone, and the way that you can do this very easily is if you have some leftover bones, you can put them from a meal or something like that. Chicken wings or something like that. You can put them in vinegar and effectively dissolve away all the calcium materials after a couple of days. And when you remove that bone from that vinegar solution, you'll find that it's quite flexible and bends very easily, because what you've done is you've dissolved all the calcium minerals away, or at least most of the calcium minerals away, and you're only left with the collagen and the organic materials of bones that allow it to be flexible. So without the inorganic materials, bone would be too soft to support body weight, and it would bend quite easily. There's a couple of diseases in which this does occur, in which organic materials are not laid down in bone tissue in sufficient quantities. And one of those, in adults, this condition is called osteomalacia. If this condition occurs in children, it's called rickets. Not only do we see composite materials being used in biological systems, human technology makes use of many, many different composite materials. And in this example that I'm going to give you is essentially a concrete foundation in which we reinforce with steel bars or rebar. So concrete is typically reinforced internally with a number of steel rods. Steel we can make ropes out of, or cabling out of, I should say. So steel tolerates pulling forces and tensile forces very well. Of course, we make steel cables, and steel cables are very common because steel can work very, very well as a rope. The steel in these, or the steel rods in concrete reinforced structures, are analogous to the collagen fibers, so they can bend and be pulled on easily without breaking. Concrete, on the other hand, tolerates compressive forces, so concrete is more like the inorganic components, the calcium minerals that we see inside of bone tissue. Concrete is not great when we put it into tension, so it's only really great at resisting compressive or crushing forces. So concrete will fail if you try to essentially if you try to make a concrete rope and try to pull things with that concrete rope. So this is why things like concrete ropes don't exist, simply because concrete does not tolerate those particular forces very well. And so concrete, as I mentioned before, is analogous to the calcium minerals that we find within bone tissue.